For 27 years, Melinda Gates lived in the most public kind of marriage, the kind that stops being just a relationship and becomes a brand. The photos always look controlled. The smiles always look practiced. The foundation's work always looked larger than any private problem. And then, in 2021, she walked away. Not with a scandalous press conference. Not with a bitter statement. Just a short announcement that sounded polite, almost sterile, and somehow that made it feel even colder. Because when a woman like Melinda leaves a man like Bill Gates, the world does not ask, what happened? The world asks, what finally became impossible to forgive? For years, people tried to answer that question for her. They pointed to rumors, to whispers, to headlines that threw around staggering settlement numbers, some even claiming figures as high as $76 billion. But the public never received a single clean document explaining the private terms. What people did get was something else. A long trail of uncomfortable stories and unresolved questions that kept circling the same theme: trust. And in 2025, at 61, Melinda finally gave the kind of clarity she had avoided for so long. Not the tabloid kind, the human kind. She spoke about a meeting in 2013 that made her feel sick. She spoke about lies that did not stop, lies that did not stay small, lies that layered on top of each other until the marriage felt less like a home and more like a stage where the script kept changing behind her back. That 2013 meeting has become a symbol because it carries the weight of moral disgust. Jeffrey Epstein, a name that does not sit in the same room as innocence. Melinda has described that encounter as deeply disturbing. The detail matters not because it is sensational, but because it reveals what her body already knew before her mind could fully accept it. Something in her life had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But the confession, the real one, is not simply about one meeting. It is about what happens after. The piling up, the silence, the way a person tries to keep a family stable, keep a mission stable, keep a public legacy stable, while privately counting the compromises they are making to stay. And then one day, the math stops working. Melinda's version of the truth is brutal in its simplicity. A marriage cannot survive when honesty is no longer the default. When trust becomes something you have to negotiate for, argue for, beg for, it stops being trust at all. It becomes a temporary ceasefire. And intimacy cannot grow inside a ceasefire. So, when she left, she did not just end a relationship. She ended a long performance. She walked away from the image of the perfect partnership and stepped into something far messier, her own integrity. Because the real reason behind that divorce was not fame, not money, not even public embarrassment. It was the moment she realized she could not remain faithful to herself while staying loyal to a story that kept demanding her silence. Melinda and French did not grow up expecting to be a global symbol of power, philanthropy, or heartbreak. She grew up in Dallas, Texas, born on August 15, 1964, in a household where discipline and warmth existed side by side. Her father worked as an aerospace engineer during the Apollo era, and in that detail alone, you can almost feel the atmosphere of her childhood. Structured, forward-looking, built around the belief that planning matters. Her mother stayed home and anchored the family with routines, values, and expectations that were steady enough to feel like safety. Their neighborhood was comfortable but not extravagant, the kind of place where you could sense stability, yet still understand that stability was something you earned and protected. In the late 1970s, her father made a decision that shaped the entire family's rhythm. He started building a small rental property business so that all 4 children could afford college. It was not a glamorous enterprise. It was paint, scraped knuckles, stubborn stains, and weekends that did not belong to leisure. By the time Melinda was 10, she was helping clean and repair apartments. By 12, she was handling simple bookkeeping, learning to balance numbers most kids her age had never even seen. Those tasks did more than teach her work ethic. They taught her a quiet truth that would follow her into adulthood. Responsibility feels lighter when the burden is shared and opportunities are created, not wished into existence. That lesson fed directly into the way she developed her sense of independence. She did not learn it as a slogan. She learned it as a lived pattern. Each cleaned apartment meant tuition saved later. Each careful record meant fewer surprises and more control. She understood early that freedom does not appear out of nowhere. It is built, line by line, decision by decision, often long before anyone applauds. Then something unexpected arrived in her home, and it did not look like destiny at first. It looked like a beige box. Her father brought home an Apple II computer, and for a teenage girl in that era, the machine was not common, not trendy, and definitely not designed with her in mind. Yet she was drawn to it. The cursor blinking on the screen offered a kind of fairness she rarely found elsewhere. The machine did not care who she was. It cared whether her logic worked. She began using it to track rental records, typing commands again and again until the system responded. That repetition, that calm demand for precision, was comforting. It gave her a private world where effort turned directly into results, no social negotiation required. When she entered Ursuline Academy, an all-girls Catholic school, her seriousness stood out. She leaned into math and science, and she responded to challenge the way she had been trained at home, with discipline rather than drama. Ursuline was among the early schools in Texas to bring computers into the classroom, and that decision tightened her focus. By the time she graduated as valedictorian in 1982, she carried more than top grades. She carried a steady confidence that technology was not just a tool. It was a doorway into the future. Even as a teenager, she began tutoring younger students in math and programming for $5 an hour. It was not only about money. Teaching gave her something else, proof that she could translate complexity into clarity and that helping others understand difficult things sharpened her own mind. That skill would become one of her most durable assets later, in boardrooms, in philanthropic negotiations, and eventually in public interviews where every sentence carried weight. At Duke University, she stepped into a more intimidating environment. In computer science classes, she was often one of the only women. Male students spoke quickly, loudly, without hesitation, and she felt the shift instantly. In one early course, the professor used a programming language she had never seen, and she had a moment of doubt that felt sharp and personal. But she did not retreat. She studied harder, adapted faster, and rebuilt her confidence from the inside out. By 1986, she had completed a bachelor's degree in computer science and economics, and soon after she earned her MBA. What those years created was not simply an impressive resume. They created a pattern of character, a woman trained to solve problems, to endure pressure, to keep moving when the room was not designed to welcome her. And long before the world knew her as Melinda Gates, she had already become someone who understood a simple principle. Independence is not a personality trait. It is a practice. When Melinda arrived in Seattle in 1987, she did not walk into a finished empire. She walked into a company that still felt like a high-speed experiment, loud with ambition, sharp with competition, and dominated by the kind of confidence that rarely waits for permission. She was 23, newly armed with an MBA, and she took a product manager role at Microsoft because she chose growth over comfort. That decision, on paper, looked like a career move. In real life, it was the first step into a world that would eventually reshape her identity, her marriage, and the way the public would see her for decades. Inside Microsoft, she was not treated like a celebrity in waiting. She was treated like an employee in a pressure cooker. Deadlines did not care about her background. Meetings were often more like contests than conversations. She later described a culture that could feel aggressive, where people spoke over one another, where loudness sometimes passed for leadership. At one point early on, she considered quitting, not because she lacked skill, but because the environment demanded a kind of emotional armor that many women were never taught they would need. She stayed anyway. She learned the rhythm. She learned the rules. Then she learned how to win without becoming the loudest person in the room. Her work focused on multimedia and consumer information products at a time when that category still felt like unfamiliar territory. The transcript frames this period as a sequence of projects that trained her to think at scale. interactive CD-ROM products, digital reference tools, and software designed for ordinary families trying to understand what computers could do. It is important because it shows what she was becoming, not simply a technologist, but a builder of systems, teams, and product strategy. She shipped things. She managed pressure. She carried responsibility. That matters later because it complicates the lazy narrative that she was merely Bill's partner. In those rooms, her last name did not buy her credibility. Products did. And somewhere inside that same company, the most consequential relationship of her life began quietly, deliberately, and at first privately. She and Bill Gates started dating around the late 1980s. In the transcript, their early relationship is described as secretive because of workplace rules, which added a layer of tension. This was not a romance unfolding in the open. It was a partnership forming under the fluorescent lights of a corporate world where reputations were currency. They built something that was part personal, part intellectual, part ambition. 3 years passed. Then, on January 1st, 1994, they married on the island of Lanai in Hawaii in a small ceremony with only about 20 guests. The smallness of the wedding is telling. 2 people surrounded by enormous machines, wealth, technology, media, choosing a private moment that could not be purchased with more spectacle. The transcript also emphasizes something that often gets ignored. Melinda negotiated. She entered that marriage with a clear sense of equality and a strong prenuptial agreement. That choice is not romantic in the traditional sense, but it is deeply revealing. It suggests a woman who understood power. She did not marry into it blindly. She defined terms. She protected her agency. And that instinct, the instinct to insist on equal footing, becomes one of the key threads later when the marriage begins to fracture. In the years after the wedding, she kept working. She stayed in the pressure cooker through her first pregnancy, still leading teams and shipping products, still wearing her badge, still living the relentless Microsoft tempo. The transcript portrays her as rising fast, moving from smaller projects to managing major consumer product groups, eventually leading large teams and shaping software used in homes and schools. Whether the details are remembered by the public or not, the emotional truth lands. She was not a decorative spouse parked beside a famous man. She was a high-performing executive living inside a culture that demanded performance every day. Then came the crossroads. By the mid-1990s, she faced a choice many women recognize, even without billionaire stakes. Keep climbing inside one of the most competitive companies in the world, or step away to raise children. She left Microsoft in the mid-1990s, and the world later treated that as if she had simply stepped off a train because she could afford to. But the deeper reading is this. She made a decision to shift from corporate power to a different kind of power, family, then philanthropy, without losing her identity as strategist. The philanthropic story that followed was not a sudden burst of generosity. It was a careful construction. In the transcript's framing, early giving evolved into the consolidation of multiple family initiatives into what became the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And once the foundation was built at scale, it became something far bigger than charity. It became an institution that could influence health policy, education reform, global development priorities, and the language of what impact was supposed to look like. Melinda's role inside that institution is often described in public as co-chair, a title that sounds shared and symmetrical. But the lived reality of being co-chair in a marriage where one person is already a world-famous founder is rarely symmetrical in the ways that matter emotionally. The foundation gave her a platform, but it also welded her identity to Bill's in the eyes of the world. Every decision, every appearance, every project, every controversy shared. And for a long time, that shared platform looked like purpose. It looked like a mission strong enough to outshine any private strain. But this is where the pressure begins to turn from inspirational to suffocating. Because the more the foundation became a global symbol, the more Melinda's private life had to remain stable for the symbol to hold. The world does not easily accept that a marriage can be collapsing while the philanthropic machine is still functioning. People demand consistency. They demand the fairy tale. And the longer that fairy tale runs, the harder it is to admit that something underneath it is rotting. The transcript hints at the emotional cost that arrived quietly. The sense that she was mentoring women, advocating for girls, pushing systems to change, while also watching from inside how powerful men behave when they think consequences are optional. It suggests that she saw things that sat badly with her values, and that the tension did not vanish just because the public image remained polished. Over time, the distance between what she believed and what she was expected to tolerate became the kind of distance that creates insomnia, dread, and that slow, internal question: how long can I keep doing this without losing myself? This is the threshold part 3 ends on. Melinda had built the skills, the authority, and the public reputation to be a global force. She had also built a life so intertwined with Bill Gates that leaving would not be a divorce alone. It would be a cultural shock. And somewhere in the background, while the foundation's work expanded and the world applauded, the private ledger of trust was already being audited. Quietly, relentlessly, until one day, the numbers no longer added up. By the mid-2010s, the Gates marriage had become something most couples never have to carry: a private relationship living inside a public institution. The foundation was no longer just a charitable vehicle. It was a global symbol, a machine with partnerships, metrics, and expectations that reached far beyond their home. In that kind of life, marital tension does not stay marital. It becomes operational risk. It becomes reputational risk. It becomes a silent pressure that asks both partners to keep the story intact, even when the truth starts slipping underneath it. From the outside, the story looked consistent. Two powerful people, one shared mission, one unified front. But inside, according to the way Melinda later described it, something was changing at the level that matters most: trust. Not a single dramatic betrayal that explodes overnight, but the exhausting kind of erosion where you wake up one day and realize you have been negotiating reality for too long. And when trust erodes in a marriage that is also a public brand, the pain multiplies. You're not only trying to protect your heart, you're trying to protect an entire narrative that other people have invested in. Then came the meeting that would later become a symbol of disgust and regret. The transcript frames it plainly. In 2013, Melinda accompanied Bill to meet Jeffrey Epstein, and the encounter made her feel sick. She later described him as evil personified. That language matters because it is not ambiguous. It is not diplomatic. It is the kind of moral clarity that arrives when your instincts are screaming and your mind is trying to stay composed. In that moment, she understood something that could not be smoothed over by public relations or philanthropic achievements. Some doors, once opened, leave a stain. What made it worse was not only the fact that the meeting happened, it was the implication that it did not stop. The transcript suggests that Melinda became furious when she learned the connection continued, that it became a recurring sore spot, and that this association represented a line she could not accept. When you look at it through her eyes, it was not just about one man's bad judgment. It was about boundaries. It was about whether her partner's definition of acceptable behavior matched hers. And when the answers to those questions diverge, the marriage stops feeling like partnership and starts feeling like compromise with your own values. But the Epstein element was only one part of a larger pattern. The transcript layers in other stressors that created the feeling of a marriage under siege. There is the picture of corporate power and its messy consequences: accusations, investigations, internal culture problems, and the repeated sensation that the rules were not applied equally when powerful men were involved. It describes an incident in 2017 where a woman connected to a business linked to Gates's financial world accused a senior figure of sexual harassment, followed by a settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. The key detail in the transcript is not the legal mechanism. It is Melinda's response. She pushed for an outside investigation. She demanded that the matter be treated seriously. That shift is crucial. It signals a woman no longer willing to accept quiet resolutions as the price of stability. Then the transcript points to the Microsoft board investigation in 2019 into allegations of a relationship between Bill and a Microsoft employee. In the story's framing, that investigation and the surrounding headlines did not simply threaten Bill's reputation. They threatened Melinda's sense of reality. Because when a marriage is built on a shared identity, the misconduct of one partner becomes a weight the other partner is forced to carry in public. Every headline becomes a question people ask you without asking. Did you know? Did you accept it? Did you excuse it? Did you stay anyway? And this is where Melinda's later words about lies piling up start to land with more force. Lies do not always mean a single secret. They can mean a long series of omissions, half-truths, and carefully managed narratives that ask one spouse to smile while the other spouse controls the full picture. Over time, that kind of living creates a psychological cost that people underestimate. In the transcript, Melinda's internal world begins to show symptoms: nightmares, panic, a sense of being trapped inside a life that is no longer stable. Her book and interviews later framed therapy as a turning point, not because it made her stronger, but because it gave her language for something she had been surviving quietly. One phrase carries the emotional core. She learned how to respond to betrayal without betraying herself. That is not just self-help phrasing. It is a confession that she had been living in a state where every response felt like a moral test. Do you stay loyal to the public story? Or do you stay loyal to your own integrity? Do you protect the institution? Or do you protect your mind? The transcript describes a breaking moment during a trip to New Mexico in late 2019. The language suggests something like a waking nightmare, a psychological rupture that revealed the depth of stress she was carrying. Whether the details were dramatic or quiet, the meaning is the same. Her body began to refuse what her public life demanded. That is often how these stories truly turn. Not with a press leak, not with a courtroom, with a nervous system finally saying enough. After that trip, the transcript frames the next step as inevitable. When she returned, she began serious divorce talks. Quietly, strategically. The kind of separation that happens behind closed doors while the world still sees the photo ops and assumes everything is fine. That gap between what the public thinks and what you are living is its own kind of loneliness. Because you are making the biggest decision of your life, while everyone around you continues to treat your marriage as a permanent institution. By the time the divorce became public in May 2021, the ending had already happened emotionally. The announcement simply confirmed what she had known for a long time. The relationship was irretrievably broken. In the transcript's framing, that break was not rooted in one headline. It was rooted in accumulated betrayal, accumulated dishonesty, accumulated value conflicts that made intimacy impossible. When people ask for the real reason, they often want a single sharp detail they can repeat. But Part 4 makes clear that the real reason was structural. It was the collapse of trust inside a marriage that demanded trust to survive. And when Melinda finally stepped away, it was not only a divorce from Bill Gates. It was a divorce from the idea that her silence was the glue holding everything together. When the divorce announcement finally hit in May 2021, it landed with the strange force of something both sudden and overdue. Sudden for the public because the Gates marriage had been marketed for decades as one of the last untouchable unions in modern America. Overdue for Melinda because by the time the statement was released, the decision had already been living inside her for months, possibly longer. That is the cruelest detail in many high-profile breakups. The world experiences the shock in one afternoon, while the person who leaves has already spent a long season quietly grieving, negotiating, and preparing to survive the fallout. For weeks, the headlines focused on the usual temptations: money, blame, gossip, and the thrill of watching a powerful couple finally crack. People threw around numbers as if they were confirmed truths, as if a marriage can be measured like a business transaction. But the core of Melinda's story, the thing she would later admit more clearly, was never about a figure on paper. It was about what her nervous system could no longer tolerate. It was about the cost of staying in a life where trust had become unstable, where truth felt managed, and where her identity had been welded to a partnership that was no longer emotionally safe. Behind the scenes, the separation became logistical. Lawyers and advisors handled assets. Schedules were rearranged. Security details were reconsidered. And perhaps most importantly, she began building the emotional scaffolding required to stand alone in public after spending almost 3 decades being viewed as one half of a single entity. That kind of reinvention is not cosmetic. It is psychological. It is waking up and realizing that even your name carries a story you did not fully write, and now you have to decide what parts of it you will keep. Melinda did not present her departure as revenge. She framed it as necessity. Over time, in interviews and in her own writing, she described the internal consequences that accumulated before she left. Nightmares, anxiety, panic, a constant sense that the ground underneath her life was shifting. People often underestimate how a betrayal functions inside a long marriage. It is not only the act itself, it is the after effect. It is the moment you begin questioning whether you can trust your own perception, because your reality has been edited. It is the exhaustion of trying to remain gracious while privately wondering what else you do not know. And when she spoke later about lies piling up, she was not describing a single revelation. She was describing a pattern of living with uncertainty until uncertainty becomes its own form of violence. The public wanted her to name one clean reason, one moment, one villain, one definitive piece of evidence that would make the story feel tidy. But the truth she eventually offered was messy and far more relatable. Trust and honesty were no longer present in the way a marriage requires. Without them, intimacy becomes performance. Partnership becomes management. The relationship stops being a place where you rest and starts being a place where you endure. After the divorce was finalized, the next chapter unfolded like a slow uncoupling of an empire. There was the foundation, the central monument of their shared life, the institution that carried both their names and served as proof to many people that their marriage was bigger than romance. For years, the foundation had functioned as a public counterweight to any private rumors. Whatever was happening in their home, the mission remained. That mission made it harder for the world to imagine them separating, because people confuse shared purpose with shared health. But purpose can mask pain for a long time, and then one day it cannot. For Melinda, the foundation became both legacy and constraint. Remaining in it meant remaining inside the most visible symbol of the partnership she had just ended. Leaving it meant relinquishing the platform she helped build. That is not a simple choice, especially for someone whose identity is tied to impact and outcomes. Yet, over time, her trajectory became clearer. She was moving away from the we and toward an unapologetic I. She had already built pivotal ventures as a separate vehicle aimed at advancing women and families, and that kind of work is not only philanthropic. It is personal. It reflects values. It reflects the desire to direct money and energy without negotiation, without compromise, without needing to protect someone else's reputation as part of the cost of doing good. The most dramatic shift, however, was not institutional. It was internal. Melinda began describing her life after divorce not as collapse, but as reconstruction. Therapy was not a footnote. It was infrastructure. She did not speak about healing like a motivational influencer. She spoke about it like a woman who had been forced to confront a painful truth. You can spend years serving a mission, serving a family, serving a shared legacy, while quietly losing access to yourself. And once you notice that loss, you either keep shrinking or you choose to recover what you gave away. This is where the transcript's idea of her confessing becomes meaningful. Because the confession is not just, this happened. The confession is, I stayed longer than I should have. It is, I tried to make it work while part of me was breaking. It is, I paid the psychological price of holding the public story together. And then, eventually, it is, I stopped. As the years moved forward, the public saw new signals that she was no longer managing perception. She spoke more openly about boundaries. She confirmed that she was in a happy relationship. She talked about peace not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Those statements were small, but they carried weight because they contradicted the cultural expectation that a divorced woman must remain either bitter or broken. Melinda's tone suggested something else: relief. Relief is rarely celebrated in these stories, but it is often the most honest emotion on the other side of a long, painful marriage. By 2025, her memoir The Next Day gave the story a sharper spine. Not because it revealed every detail the internet wanted, but because it clarified the moral framework she was operating within. She did not present herself as a saint. She presented herself as a woman who reached a line where self-respect mattered more than appearances. She wrote about how trust is not optional, how honesty is not decorative, how a marriage cannot survive when the truth is treated like a negotiable resource. And in that framing, the real reason behind the divorce becomes clear. She left because staying would have required her to keep betraying her own values to preserve a shared image. That is what changed everything people thought they knew. The Gates divorce was never just a billionaire breakup. It was a public reminder that even the most powerful partnerships can rot from the same human causes as any ordinary marriage: secrecy, dishonesty, boundary violations, and the slow suffocation of living beside someone you no longer trust. And when Melinda finally spoke, she was not offering gossip. She was offering a verdict, not on Bill, not for the public's entertainment, but on her own life. The cost of silence had become too high, and she was done paying it. After the divorce was finalized, the world expected a clean, linear aftermath. Two billionaires separate, assets shift, headlines fade, and the story becomes a footnote. But Melinda's post-divorce life did not move like a footnote. It moved like an unspooling. Because the marriage was not the only thing she had built with Bill Gates. The foundation was their shared monument, their shared proof, their shared language of legitimacy. And for Melinda, that made the next step emotionally harder than the divorce itself. Leaving a husband is one kind of rupture. Leaving an institution that carries your name, your work, and your identity is another. In the months and years that followed, she did not rush to perform freedom for the cameras. Instead, she moved with the quiet seriousness that has always defined her. She talked about therapy as a tool, not a trend, and she framed healing as something practical, learning how to respond to betrayal without betraying yourself. That sentence carries an entire philosophy. It suggests that the real danger of a broken marriage is not only what your partner does to you, but what you start doing to yourself to survive it. The shrinking, the rationalizing, the silencing of your instincts, the slow habit of accepting what you once would have refused. Her work became the pathway back to her own center. Pivotal Ventures, which the transcript positions as a major vehicle in her independent chapter, was not simply an investment firm. It was a statement of control, a way to decide priorities without negotiating them through a shared platform and without protecting anyone else's public image as part of the cost. Instead of being one half of a philanthropic couple, she was building a structure that reflected her personal convictions about women's power, caregiving, opportunity, and economic security. And then came the most symbolic break, stepping down from the Gates Foundation. When she eventually left, it marked more than a job change. It marked a final uncoupling from the shared identity the world had placed on her for decades. She was no longer co-chair, no longer a public partner in an institution that would always be read as an extension of the marriage. That act forced people to confront a truth they had avoided. Melinda was not simply leaving Bill Gates. She was leaving the Gates story. The public also began to see changes in her personal language. After years of restraint, she allowed small admissions that felt almost shocking because of how normal they were. She said she was in a happy relationship. She spoke about peace. She spoke about the idea that trust and honesty are not negotiable if you want real intimacy. Those are not sensational lines, but they carry weight because they're the kind of lines people say only after they have rebuilt their internal boundaries. Her memoir, The next day sharpened that boundary work into something the public could finally understand. The point of the book was not to expose every private detail. It was to explain the emotional logic of leaving. She framed the divorce as necessary because honesty and trust were no longer present in the way a marriage requires. In her view, intimacy is impossible when dishonesty sits at the center. That framing is crucial because it refuses the audience's desire for a single scandal and replaces it with something more uncomfortable, a pattern of erosion that breaks a person down over time. This is where the transcript's idea of confession becomes more than a headline. The confession is not only that something happened. The confession is that she had to accept what she already knew, that she had to stop bargaining with reality, that she had to choose integrity over appearance. And choosing integrity in her position meant accepting a level of public scrutiny most people will never face. Even her philanthropy after divorce reads differently when you look at it through that lens. When she commits large sums to women and girls, it is not just generosity. It is alignment. It is her saying openly that she is done living inside structures that demand women accommodate power at the expense of themselves. She is trying to finance alternatives, systems where women are not asked to be silent to keep an institution stable, where caregiving is valued, where opportunity is not a favor handed down from the top, but a foundation built into the world. So the real story of the aftermath is not luxury or revenge. It is reclamation. It is a woman separating not only from a man, but from a lifetime of shared identity, and then choosing to become legible on her own terms. The divorce ended a marriage. But the years after the divorce reveal what it truly ended. The expectation that she should carry someone else's contradictions as the price of standing in the same frame. What makes Melinda Gates' story linger is not that a billionaire marriage ended. Wealthy people divorce every day, and money has a way of absorbing shock. What lingers is the image of a woman who spent decades inside a carefully engineered narrative, then chose to dismantle it with her own hands. In the public imagination, she was the partner, the stabilizer, the moral counterweight. In private, she was a person paying the quiet price of staying composed while trust collapsed behind the curtain. When she finally spoke more openly, it did not feel like revenge. It felt like a boundary, drawn late but drawn in permanent ink. After the divorce was finalized, she did what many people do after a long emotional war, except she did it under a microscope. She rebuilt. She redirected her focus toward women and families with sharper independence, using her influence through pivotal ventures, and then, later, by stepping away from the Gates Foundation entirely. That departure mattered. For years, the foundation had been the symbol of their union, a shared institution that seemed bigger than any personal fracture. Leaving it was not just a professional decision. It was the final separation from a platform that, for a long time, required her to share a name and a legacy with a man she no longer shared a life with. And yet, her story is not a clean moral parable where one person is pure and the other is rotten. Real divorces rarely offer that kind of simplicity. What her account emphasizes again and again is not villainy. It is chemistry turning toxic when honesty disappears. It is the human reality that love cannot survive on speeches, projects, or public purpose if private trust is gone. She has described how therapy helped her keep her integrity intact, and that detail is crucial because it reframes the narrative. This was not only a breakup. It was a reclamation of self, built slowly through painful self-confrontation, not through a sudden burst of empowerment. So what is the real legacy here? It may be that Melinda's most important act was not any single grant, book, or speech, but the decision to stop being the person who makes dysfunction look stable. In a world that often trains women to be the silent shock absorbers of powerful men, her exit carried a different message. You can love your children, honor your past, and still refuse to remain inside a relationship that requires you to shrink. But there is still an open question that hangs over everything, and it is the question that makes this story feel unfinished. If the marriage had never carried a global mission, would the trust have broken sooner, or would it have been easier to leave? How many compromises were made in the name of the greater good? And where's the line between sacrifice and self-erasure? Melinda's choice forces the audience to confront something uncomfortable. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is not to hold a powerful institution together, but to step away and let the truth finally breathe.